Ferguson, host of the Ben Ferguson Show and author of It's My America Too. And Brent Knutson is the founder and managing partner of Partnership Capital Growth Advisors. And Republican Representative Darrell Issa of California is here. All right, gentlemen, good to see you guys. Brent, let me start with you. Do we need to differentiate between bigger is better and bigger is something different than merger activity? What do you think?
Yes. I think merging companies that are inefficient is always going to be good. There is a point where merging is just too big, but merging can help get rid of overhead, infrastructure, and bring profit to the bottom line, which is what we need in today's world.
Congressman, bigger, better necessarily?
Generally, a merger, it does drive efficiencies, but I think uniquely when you're looking at regulated entities that have to have firewalls, such as regulated banks versus non-regulated financial institutions, there's a real case for whether those synergies are legitimate or, in fact, because they're prohibited from commingling funds, it works to the detriment of two separate, efficient organizations being formed.
Ben, what about the consumer at the end of the day? I mean, merger activity may work well for the corporations involved, but what about the end user?
Well, I think right now what you're seeing, it's not good for the end user. And I think you look at the financial system that we have right now. The big failed. And the government has been forcing them to get together. So I don't like this right now because I think it's not real and true mergers. When you have the government stepping in, doing what they're doing, they're forcing these companies to come together, and these companies are forcing these partnerships together mainly because they need the government funds or they want them. And I think that is really bad for the consumer. If it's bigger is better if it's real and true growth. But what we're seeing right now is only going to hurt the little guy because you're forcing these people to get so big so quickly that smaller companies, I think, are going to be hurt. And that's when, as you know, small businesses are going to be hurt. So right now, this isn't real bigger, better growth, in my opinion.
Congressman, you're shaking your head. You agree or disagree?
I agree with them. If you look at the craziness of Bank of America being told by Merrill Lynch, it's, do it, we'll give you the money, you realize, well, wait a second here. You had organizations which are traders that should not be doing anything but handling transactions. Then you had regulated banks. Then you had these toxic instruments that have been, in some cases, held by these organizations. There was no logical reason to merge these organizations, and yet government intervention saw the logic and ordered it.
I mean, look, Brent, you have to admit, you've seen things like PNC National City Corp. You've seen things like Wells Fargo purchasing Wachovia. Now, some of these were orchestrated by the U.S. government to make sure that a financial institution didn't fail. Now, do those work, but then others don't?
Sure. I think that there are times when bringing companies like that together are going to get rid of inefficiencies and, again, bring profit to the bottom line and, quite frankly, rationalize industries that are irrational. Use another example, the newspaper industry. I think that there are places today that it needs to be consolidated. Otherwise, the papers will fail. I don't know that's always true in the banks that we're talking about, but I think there's a lot of times that is, and the market will regulate that. If the banks get too big, like Citigroup, I think they'll regulate themselves, and I'm not sure the government should step in to get in the way of that trouble.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
And I think one of the main things here that we're missing, and I think this administration is really missing in Washington right now, is sometimes it's okay for things to fail. And sometimes bigger businesses need to fail for the smaller ones to become big again. And I think that's the biggest problem right now is we've had this mentality that if it is so big and enough people depend on you that you cannot fail.
Yeah,
and the fact is, if you look over history, the bigger they fall, the more that new companies and new technology comes up.
Okay, but here's the problem. I couldn't agree with you more. This is what outrages me most. This is not a Republican or a Democratic issue, but you've got the likes of Ben Bernanke and many different lawmakers, the Treasury Secretary, who are basically saying failure is not an option. So, Congressman, how do we get past that? Because right now, there are all these people who say, wait a second, if Goldman can pay the money, if J.P. Morgan can pay back the money, then it's okay for us to see that some of these companies need further injections, but the U.S. government has basically said, we're back and stopping all of them.
You're absolutely right. And since Hank Paulson's time, which seems like a long time ago to many of us, what you've had is a one-size-fits-all. Here's a Goldman Sachs day trader, as I like to call him, who is making decisions about banks and what's good for banks. He spent his whole career bashing banks and trying to be an alternative. And so all along we've had this one-size-fits-all for the financial community rather than, as Bill Isaac and other people who knew about banks said, look, treat the bank portion as a bank portion, particularly domestically. Treat these instruments as instruments if they're held domestically and look at other institutions through their appropriate regulation. We've done just the opposite. We lumped them all together and in some cases forced them to come together.
You know, Brent, I had this conversation with Lawrence Summers when I interviewed him about a week or so ago. We got into a little conversation off camera about Citigroup, and I said, look, this is a bank that is in, what, 170 countries, okay? You look at the regulatory hurdles that Vikram Pandit has to address on a day-to-day basis by addressing financial concerns in all of those different countries. No wonder it's impossible to manage. I mean, you got to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. And then you look at the evolution of Bank of America and Hugh McCall, and he was basically the merger and acquisition megamania man of the 80s. That didn't necessarily put Bank of America in the best of situations.
No, again, I think that's true, and I think we're actually in agreement on this, that there is a place where mergers become inefficient and that the market then can regulate that. I think the market is regulating. You have people like Gary Crittenden from Citibank, for example, who was a big proponent of the original consolidations, who is now running their alternative area and really proponing a breakup of a lot of those areas. And I think our group, for example, is essentially a boutique investment bank that the point just made, we focus on one thing, mergers and acquisitions. We don't focus on banking or other areas, and I think that's true. That's where that matters. But I think, again, there are places where the smaller companies and their innovation creates an opportunity for bigger companies to merge with them.
Yeah, and Ben, look, I mean, what about the retailers? I mean, let's be frank about it. I mean, if you look at the level of bankruptcies that we're seeing, particularly in the high-yield debt markets, it's largely in areas where there's just too many and consolidation is needed. The retailer is an example of why mergers actually work, Ben.
Sure, I mean, that's fine, but that's when it's a true merger and a true acquisition between two companies saying, okay, look, there's way too many of us, let's join together and have better buying power. I'm all for that. That is the American dream, capitalism. But when you have companies that are trying to mutate and do something to get the goodwill of the government or taxes or a bailout, and changing what they do that they've never done before to accomplish it. You watch, next year, we're going to have some big failures because the government's not going to be able to step in, and that's when the real problems are going to happen.
You know, I got to switch gears here. Let's call an audible for a moment, because we had Glenn Beck on. I like to use sports analogies, and Glenn is outrageous, and we love him for certain things, and for certain things we think is off the wall, but he causes a lot of anxiety, and he's comparing what we're seeing. He was comparing it to Nazi Germany and what's going on, and it gets a little out of control here. But what he's saying is what happened to the foundation of this country, where it was about free capital markets? Is that fair? Have we given up failure and free capital markets? Is the American dream alive and kicking? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think innovation is what will bring us back, actually. And I think that's the key. Is that I think some of these companies, the startups, I'm from Silicon Valley. Companies start up in large part knowing that eventually they can be purchased or merged into a more efficient infrastructure, and so they don't develop all of that infrastructure. I think it's very much alive, and certainly where I live, innovation is still key.
Congressman?
Well, I'll tell you.
I got to be honest with you, I disagree. I think it's punch drunk right now, and I'll tell you why. I think there's a lot of people out there that right now don't know how to succeed because they've told that they cannot do it without the government being involved in their lives. This last presidential campaign was about two things: either you deciding you can do it on your own, or being able to, or needing the government to be able to accomplish something, and that's what won. But I think there's a lot of people, especially young entrepreneurs, that are so terrified of starting their own business, or they think they can't do it because they can't get a loan, there's no money, even though they haven't tried, and it's making people stop being dreamers and thinkers and trying to accomplish things because they're terrified right now of this market.
I just don't believe that, but go ahead.
Well, I think what we probably can both agree on is that if the government had been the mezzanine and angel capital and venture capital in Silicon Valley, there wouldn't be a Silicon Valley.
Right. Yep.
By definition, the way government brings their money in drives away private capital. Public-private is never about that. It's about any private money comes in only if, oh yeah, all the risk is on the public side. That's not what made Silicon Valley. And freedom to fail and fear of failure is what causes people to work 16 and 18-hour days so they don't fail.
Congressman, you know, just before we wrap up here, you, as one of the lawmakers in D.C., are one of the ones who are being attacked for not letting the free flow of capital markets. I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but I do think some of what we're seeing is not that the American dream is dead. It's just that confidence right now is so beatered. You know, people are batting down the hatches. They're nervous. They don't know what's coming because all they hear is the doom and gloom story.
What's amazing is if you had this $1.2 trillion, subprime market, and if it had been allowed to hemorrhage, the rest of the market stabilized, but allow that to hemorrhage, and if the underlying assets are worth half, we'd have a $600 billion total write-off. You've got $120 billion a year that is being made by the same organizations. It's not insurmountable. So if you take a worst case of everything going wrong, as soon as someone came in to buy those assets at their fair current market, the actual trade, the markets would have righted themselves. Instead, we've got $6 trillion at Freddie and Fannie on the line. We've got $1.2 trillion here, 600 and some billion of the 700 billion spent. You realize we've spent and guaranteed and invested far more than the problem we said we were attacking. That's what government does when you let them their nose under the tent flap. They just keep coming in. Now the problem is they're even saying they're going to refuse to leave even if they can get their money back with full interest.
It's an unbelievable story. Brent, Congressman Issa, and Ben, that was our first and best roundtable. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I hope you guys will come back. We can argue about a couple other things, too. All right, guys, let's send it over to Connell. We've got some more breaking news. Connell?
Well, another bank missing.